A mountain man trudging through the scorching canyon slopes stumbled upon an abandoned cabin with the word "Leave" scrawled in blood on the wall. It happened at dusk, when he was desperate for water and shelter after a grueling day under the merciless sun. The crimson letters hinted at something far worse than a simple warning, and he stepped inside, unaware that this choice would haunt him forever. This is how a story began that left scars on more than just his skin. Dive into this mystery and uncover what lay hidden within those walls. Hey, listener, how's it going, and where are you tuning in from? The mountain man staggered along the rocky canyon trail, his boots kicking up clouds of dust under the relentless sun. His name was Elias Kane, a wiry figure with a weathered face, carrying little more than a worn rifle and a half-empty canteen. The heat pressed down like a heavy hand, and his throat burned for water after days of wandering the Wyoming wilds. He'd been tracking a deer for miles, but the trail had gone cold, leaving him with nothing but aching legs and a growling stomach. Then, through the haze, he spotted it. A crooked cabin leaning against a jagged cliff, its wood bleached gray by years of neglect. Elias paused, squinting at the structure. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt off, like a whisper of trouble carried on the dry wind. He adjusted the rifle strap on his shoulder and approached, each step crunching on the gravelly earth. The door hung ajar, creaking faintly as a gust swept through the canyon. Inside, the air was thick with the musty smell of dust and decay, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. He froze when he saw it. Scrawled across the far wall in jagged crimson letters was a single word: "Leave." The blood, long dried, seemed to pulse in the dim light filtering through a cracked window. His hand tightened on the rifle and his pulse quickened, though he wasn't sure why. Elias had faced grizzlies and bandits before, but this was different. Something about the silence in the cabin felt alive, watching him. He stepped closer to the wall, his eyes tracing the uneven letters. Whoever wrote this had been desperate, maybe afraid, or maybe they'd meant to scare someone else. He glanced around, half expecting to see eyes in the shadows, but the room was empty. Just a rickety table, a broken chair, and a pile of ash in the corner where a fire had once burned. Elias muttered under his breath, trying to shake the unease. "Ain't no one here," he told himself, but his voice sounded small in the heavy quiet. He'd planned to rest here, maybe find some forgotten supplies, but the bloody warning gnawed at him. He could turn back, keep walking until he found a stream or a camp. Yet something held him there, a stubborn spark of curiosity, or maybe defiance. He'd never been one to run from trouble, even when it stared him in the face. Setting his canteen on the table, he decided to stay, at least for the night. The canyon was no place to be wandering after dark, and he'd be damned if a few old letters would chase him off. Elias stood frozen in the dim cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. The bloody word, "Leave," stared back at him from the wall, its jagged letters seeming to deepen in the fading light. He forced himself to breathe, the sound loud in the stifling quiet, louder even than the faint whistle of wind slipping through the cracked window. His fingers twitched toward the rifle propped against the table, but he didn't pick it up. Not yet. Something about the air felt wrong, like the cabin was holding its breath, waiting for his next move. He took a cautious step forward, eyes darting to the corners of the room. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow flicker in the far corner, quick and silent, like a figure ducking out of sight. He blinked hard, shaking his head. "Just the light playing tricks," he muttered, but his voice wavered, betraying the unease crawling up his spine. The floorboards creaked as he moved closer to the wall, studying the crimson streaks. The blood was old, flaking in places, but the message was clear. Someone had wanted to be heard, and Elias couldn't shake the feeling they were speaking to him. Curiosity tugged at him, sharper now than the fear gnawing at his gut. He ran a calloused finger along the edge of the table where dust lay thick except for a single clear patch, as if something had been moved recently. His gaze swept the room again. No footprints, no signs of life, just the oppressive stillness. He crouched, peering under the table, half expecting to find something hidden, but there was only more dust and a splintered chair leg. Standing, he turned toward the corner where he'd seen that flicker. Nothing, just a pile of ash and a rusted tin can. "Get a grip, Elias," he said aloud, his words swallowed by the cabin's heavy air. He wanted to laugh off the tension, to chalk it up to exhaustion and an empty stomach, but the bloody warning wouldn't let him. He stepped toward the door, thinking maybe he'd sleep outside after all, when a faint sound stopped him. A soft scrape, like boots on stone coming from somewhere beyond the walls. He held his breath, listening. The wind, an animal, or something else. The sound didn't come again, but it was enough to keep him inside. Whatever this place was, it had a story, and Elias wasn't the kind to walk away from one. He set his jaw, grabbed his rifle, and moved deeper into the cabin, his shadow trailing long and dark behind him. Elias's boots scuffed against the warped floorboards as he stood in the center of the cabin, the bloody leave still burning in his mind. His eyes landed on a rickety table in the corner, where a rusted knife lay next to a cracked oil lamp, its glass clouded with grime. Beneath them, dark stains marred the wood, dried blood, smeared and splattered, as if someone had tried to wipe it away, but gave up halfway. The sight sent a chill through him, and he whispered, "Who was here?" His voice hung in the air, answered only by a faint, eerie tremble, like the cabin itself was responding. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the table in the dim light. The knife's blade was dull, its handle worn smooth, but the bloodstains told a story of violence, not neglect. Elias's stomach twisted as he imagined what might have happened here. A fight, a betrayal, or something worse. He reached out, hesitating, then nudged the lamp with his knuckle. It wobbled, threatening to tip, but stayed put. The stains beneath it were older, darker, as if the table had been a witness to something awful long before he arrived. He scanned the room again, his pulse thudding in his ears. The walls were bare, except for that single haunting word, and the air felt heavier now, pressing against his chest. He tried to shake the feeling, telling himself it was just an old cabin, just a relic of someone's bad day. But the tremble in the air lingered, like a voice he couldn't quite hear. He crouched to check under the table again, hoping for answers. A dropped letter, a forgotten tool, anything. But found only more dust and a faint scratch mark in the wood, like something heavy had been dragged across it. "Whoever you were, you left a mess," Elias muttered, standing and wiping his hands on his pants. His words felt like a challenge to the empty room, but no answer came. The silence was louder now, broken only by the faint creak of the cabin settling. He didn't want to admit it, but the blood, the knife, the lamp, they weren't just objects. They were pieces of a story he was starting to dread. Yet he couldn't leave, not now. The cabin had hooked him, and walking away felt like letting it win. He turned toward the corner where the shadow had flickered before, his hand resting on the rifle, ready for whatever this place was about to throw at him. Elias edged toward the shadowed corner of the cabin, his eyes fixed on a small wooden chest that sat half hidden behind a fallen beam. The lid was slightly ajar, as if someone had left it in a hurry, and dust motes danced in the sliver of light reaching it. He knelt down, his knees cracking from the long day's strain, and pried the lid open with careful fingers, the hinges groaning like an old man's complaint. Inside lay a jumble of forgotten items, a faded tin cup, a coiled length of rope frayed at the ends, and beneath them, a leather-bound book, its cover cracked and stained from years of exposure. He lifted the book out, feeling its weight in his hands, heavier than it looked, with the secrets it might hold. Flipping open the first page, his breath caught sharp in his throat as he read the name scrawled in faded ink, Jeremiah Holt. The letters blurred for a second, pulling him back to a dusty trail 15 years ago, where he'd last seen that name carved into a wanted poster for horse theft and worse. Jeremiah had been more than a thief. He'd been a partner once, sharing campfires and whiskey before everything went sour in a botched raid on a stagecoach. Elias had walked away from that mess alive, but Holt hadn't, or so the whispers in the saloons claimed. Memories flooded in, unbidden, sharp as a knife's edge, the crack of gunfire echoing off canyon walls, the metallic tang of blood in the air, and Holt's accusing glare as he clutched a bullet wound in his side. Elias had sworn then he'd never look back, burying the guilt under miles of solitude in the mountains. But here it was, staring up from the page, tying him to this forsaken place like an invisible rope. He traced the name with his thumb, the leather warm under his touch, and wondered how the book had ended up here. in a cabin that felt like it had been waiting for him all along. The realization hit him slow, stirring a storm in his chest that made his hands tremble. This wasn't just some stranger's junk. It was a thread from his own tangled past, unraveling now in the quiet of the room. He closed the book for a moment, staring at the wall where Leave mocked him, and whispered to the empty air, "Holt, you son of a gun, what game are you playing now?" No answer came, but the weight of the past settled deeper, urging him to keep reading, to face what he'd run from for so long. Elias set the book on the table, away from the bloodstains, and steeled himself to turn the next page, knowing it might drag him under for good. Elias sat heavily on the creaking chair, the leather book open before him, its pages yellowed and brittle like old bones. A fire roared in his chest, a mix of rage and dread that made his hands shake as he gripped the table's edge. The name Jeremiah Holt burned in his mind, dragging up memories he'd buried deep, gunshots, broken trust, and a canyon soaked in blood 15 years ago. The cabin's walls seemed to close in, the bloody Leave glaring at him like an accusation he couldn't dodge. He wanted to burn the book, burn the whole place down, but his fingers stayed glued to its cover, refusing to let go. He pushed back from the table, his breath ragged, and stood to pace the small room. Each step stirred dust that hung in the stale air, catching the last slivers of dusk filtering through the cracked window. Then he heard it, a faint crunch of gravel outside, like a boot shifting on loose stone. He froze, his hand darting to the rifle leaning against the wall. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rough but steady, expecting no answer. The silence that followed was worse, thick and heavy, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. He edged toward the door, peering through the gap, but saw only shadows stretching long across the rocky ground. "Nothing but ghosts," Elias muttered, trying to calm the storm in his head. He returned to the table, his eyes flicking between the book and the blood-stained wall. "You're losing it, old man," he said aloud, his words sharp in the quiet, as if he could argue the fear away. But it wasn't just fear. It was the weight of knowing Holt's name was here, in this nowhere cabin, tied to a past he'd never outrun. He pictured Holt's face, the sneer that had promised revenge before he'd fallen in that long-ago fight. Was this place Holt's last stand or something worse? Elias sank back into the chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the rifle across his lap. He spoke to the empty room, his voice low and jagged. "If you're here, Holt, you got something to say, say it. I ain't running." The words felt like a challenge, thrown at a shadow he couldn't see. The cabin stayed silent, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he couldn't shake the sense that something was listening, waiting for him to crack. Elias opened the book again, his heart pounding, knowing each page might pull him deeper into a truth he wasn't ready to face. Elias turned the brittle pages of the leather book with unsteady hands, the dim light from the window casting flickering shadows across the handwritten words. The entries started simple, like a journal from a man scraping by in the mountains, notes on trapping beaver, trading pelts for powder, and lead in some distant trading post. But as he read on, the tone shifted, words growing jagged and urgent, spilling out confessions that twisted his gut like a bad knife wound. Jeremiah Holt had written about a deal gone wrong, a partner who'd turned on him during that stagecoach raid, leaving him for dead in the dust with a gut full of lead. The details hit Elias like punches from an old foe. The way the partner had grabbed the gold first, firing without a second thought, and vanished into the night while Holt bled out alone. Holt didn't name the traitor outright at first, but the descriptions matched too close. Tall, wiry build, a scar on the left hand from a bar fight years back. Elias's scar itched under the page's weight, and he slammed the book shut for a breath, his chest heaving as if he'd run a mile uphill. He paced the room again, the floorboards protesting under his boots, trying to push the words away, but they clung like burrs. Opening it once more, he forced himself to keep going, the script detailing Holt's crawl to safety, nursing the wound in hidden caves until infection set in. Then came the rage, pages filled with plans for revenge, sketches of trails and camps where the partner might hide. Greed had started it all, Holt admitted, chasing easy money, with a man he barely trusted, but the betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. Elias saw his own face in those lines. The choices he'd made that night under the stars, whiskey-fueled and desperate. The book didn't stop at the past. Later entries spoke of watching from afar, trailing the traitor through towns and wilds, waiting for the right moment to even the score. Each line seared into him hotter than the desert sun at noon, stirring a whirlwind of denial and shame that made his vision blur. He whispered to the page, "You lived, didn't you? All this time you've been breathing." The cabin's silence mocked him, the blood on the wall now feeling like Holt's final mark, a demand for reckoning. Elias realized this place wasn't random. It was a trap set long ago, drawing him back to pay for the greed and violence that had shattered their bond. The story in the book built to a fever pitch, hinting at a confrontation that never happened. Or had it? He read of a meeting planned in these very canyons, a chance for confession or blood, and wondered if Holt had waited here, dying slow from old wounds. The weight of it all pressed down, turning the air thick with unspoken accusations. Elias set the book aside, his fingers numb, and stared at the knife on the table, imagining Holt's hand on it. The revelations weren't just words. They were chains, linking him to a debt he'd ignored for years, pulling him toward a truth that could break him. He rubbed his face, sweat mixing with dust, and knew he couldn't unread what he'd seen. The murder, the lies, the endless cycle of revenge that had led straight to this forsaken spot. Elias clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, the rough calluses digging into his palms as he rose from the chair with a scrape that echoed through the cabin. The book lay open on the table like an open wound, its pages spilling Holt's accusations into the dim room, and he couldn't sit with them any longer. He strode to the door, yanking it open with a force that made the hinges protest, and stepped out onto the uneven ground where the canyon walls loomed high and silent. The evening air hit him cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush from below, but the quiet wrapped around him like a shroud, amplifying the thud of his own heartbeat. He scanned the rocky slopes, his eyes straining against the gathering dusk, searching for any sign of movement, a glint of metal, a shadow that didn't belong. Nothing stirred except the occasional tumble of loose pebbles down the cliff face, dislodged by the settling earth. Elias leaned against the doorframe, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and let the silence sink in, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk wheeling overhead. The canyon stretched out vast and empty, its jagged edges cutting into the fading sky, and he felt small under it all, a speck caught in something bigger than himself. "Why me? Why this damn place?" he growled low, the words tumbling out as he kicked at a stone that skittered into the dust. The question had been building since he'd seen Holt's name gnawing at the edges of his mind like a persistent ache. He'd wandered these mountains for years, chasing solitude to outrun the ghosts, but now it seemed the land itself had conspired to drag him back. No answers came from the empty expanse, just the wind picking up, whispering through the crevices, like it was mocking his confusion. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the tension not there, and paced a few steps away from the cabin, his boots grinding into the gravel. He stopped at the edge of a drop-off, peering down into the shadowed ravine where the last light clung to the rocks. The emptiness stared back, vast and indifferent, offering no clues about how Holt's story had led here, or why fate had pointed him to this spot. Elias turned back toward the cabin, its crooked silhouette now a dark outline against the twilight, and felt the pull of unfinished business tugging at him. He'd come seeking shelter, but found a mirror to his own regrets instead, and walking away now would mean carrying the weight without facing it. With a deep breath that did little to steady him, he gripped the door handle again, the metal cool under his fingers, and stepped back inside, the question still echoing unanswered in his head. The threshold crossed once more. Elias felt the cabin's air shift, thicker now, with the weight of what he'd left unsaid outside. He didn't know if Holt had planned this, or if coincidence had a cruel sense of humor, but the lack of answers only fueled his resolve to dig deeper. He glanced at the book, then at the bloody wall, and muttered, "Ain't getting off that easy." The canyon's hush followed him in, sealing the door behind with a soft click, leaving him alone with the puzzle that refused to let go. Elias paused at the threshold for a long moment, the canyon's chills seeping through his shirt as he weighed the pull of the book against the vast emptiness outside. But the unanswered questions clawed at him, refusing to let him walk away into the night. So he turned on his heel and pushed back into the cabin's stifling warmth. The door swung shut behind him with a thud that echoed off the walls, sealing him in with the dust and shadows once more. And he moved straight to the table, where the leather volume waited like an unfinished sentence. He sank into the chair, its legs scraping against the floor, and picked up the book again, his fingers tracing the spine as if it might reveal some mercy. The pages rustled under his touch, drawing him back into Holt's world of grudges and half-healed wounds. But Elias couldn't focus at first, his mind replaying the silence outside like a warning he hadn't heeded. He set the book down and stood, rifle in hand, to check the corners of the room one more time, pushing aside the pile of ash with his boot to uncover nothing but more cobwebs. Satisfied for the moment, he returned to the table and flipped to where he'd left off, the script detailing Holt's slow recovery in these very canyons, hiding from lawmen and his own fever dreams. The words painted a picture of a man broken but unbowed, vowing to track the betrayer no matter how many years it took. He read on, the lamp's faint glow steady now as he struck a match to light it, chasing away the encroaching dark that made the bloody wall seem to writhe. Holt wrote of close calls, spotting the partner in a saloon from afar, tailing him through passes without being seen, always one step behind but closing in. Elias's throat tightened with each entry, the descriptions hitting too close to his own trails, the camps he'd chosen to avoid old faces. "You were watching me all that time," he said to the empty room, his voice cutting through the quiet like a dull blade. The admission hung there, unanswered, but it felt right, like admitting it loosened some invisible knot in his chest. A sudden gust rattled the window, but Elias kept reading, the story building to plans for a final reckoning in this isolated spot, where the canyon's walls would hide the shots. He imagined Holt here, scratching out the warning in his own blood as life ebbed away, waiting for the traitor to arrive. The details piled up, dates that matched his own wanderings, places he'd passed through without knowing eyes followed. Elias leaned back, the chair groaning under him, and stared at the ceiling beams scarred by time and neglect. He couldn't deny it anymore. This cabin was the end of Holt's line, a lure set for him alone. The wind picked up outside, howling low through the cracks, but inside, Elias felt a strange calm settle as he absorbed the full weight of the narrative. He closed the book gently, placing it beside the knife, and ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair. "Come on, then, if you're waiting," he called out, his tone flat but edged with challenge, directed at the shadows that seemed to deepen with the night. No response came, just the steady tick of settling wood, but the act of speaking it aloud made the cabin feel less like a trap and more like a courtroom, where he finally had to stand trial. Elias extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into near blackness, and leaned against the wall, rifle across his knees, determined to see this through until dawn, or whatever came first. Darkness had fully claimed the cabin now, the lamp's flame long snuffed out, leaving Elias to sit against the rough wall with only the faint moonlight slicing through the cracks to guide his eyes. His rifle rested heavy across his lap, the barrel cool against his thigh, but it did little to ease the tension coiling in his muscles like a spring ready to snap. The book's revelations still echoed in his head, Holt's words painting him as the villain in a tale he thought he'd escaped, and the silence stretched thin, broken only by the occasional shift of the wind outside. Then cutting through it all came a voice, low and raspy, real enough to raise the hairs on his neck. "You know what you did," it murmured, close as a breath on his ear, hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Elias jerked upright, his free hand fumbling for the knife on the table, knocking over the empty canteen in the process, with a clatter that seemed deafening in the quiet. He swung his head around, eyes straining into the black corners where shapes blurred into nothing, but the room stayed empty. No figure, no glint of eyes, just the same dusty outlines he'd memorized hours ago. His heart slammed against his ribs, each beat sending a jolt through his arms, and he gripped the rifle tighter, sweeping the barrel across the space in front of him. "Who's there? Show yourself," he demanded, his voice cracking despite the effort to keep it steady, the words bouncing off the walls and dying quick. The voice didn't answer right away, but the air felt thicker, charged with something he couldn't name, pressing him back against the wood until splinters dug into his shoulder. Elias rose slowly, knees protesting from the hours of sitting, and backed toward the door, his boot heels scraping softly on the floorboards to avoid any surprise from below. He reached for the handle, twisting it once, but it wouldn't budge. The wind's earlier slam had jammed it tight, or maybe something else held it fast. Panic flickered at the edges of his mind, hot and insistent, but he shoved it down, focusing on the sound of his own breathing to anchor himself. "Holt? That you? Come out and face me proper," he called again, louder this time, his tone laced with a defiance that masked the fear twisting in his gut. No footsteps followed, no shadow detached from the walls, but the voice lingered in his memory, replaying the words with a clarity that made his skin crawl. Elias slid down the wall again, rifle pointed at the darkest corner, and wiped sweat from his brow with a trembling sleeve. The strain built layer by layer, cracking the edges of his resolve like dry earth under boot heels, doubt creeping in about what was real and what his mind conjured from guilt and exhaustion. He thought of the canyon outside, the freedom just beyond the door, but trapped here, the voice's echo chipped away at him, forcing him to confront the possibility that Holt's ghost, or worse, his own conscience, had finally caught up. Elias settled into a watchful crouch, eyes unblinking in the gloom, waiting for the next whisper that might unravel him completely. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching the tension until his muscles ached from holding still, but the voice stayed silent now, leaving him alone with the crumbling barriers in his head. He muttered to himself under his breath, piecing together fragments of the book's story to make sense of it all, but the pieces wouldn't fit without admitting his role in the mess. The cabin's confines amplified every small noise, the creak of settling beams, the distant howl of coyotes, turning them into threats that fed the growing fracture in his thoughts. Elias knew he couldn't hold out forever. The pressure was building, threatening to split him open and spill out the truths he'd buried deep. Elias crouched in the dark, his back pressed against the cabin's splintered wall, the rifle's weight a cold comfort in his sweating hands. The voice's echo, "You know what you did," clung to him, sinking deeper than the chill of the night air seeping through the cracks. He realized now the bloody leave scrawled across the wall wasn't just a warning from some forgotten stranger. It was meant for him, a message carved out of the past he'd tried to outrun for 15 years. Every item in this forsaken place, the knife, the lamp, the book, seemed to pulse with memories of that night when greed and gunfire tore his life apart, leaving Holt bleeding in the dirt. He rose slowly, his joints stiff from holding still too long, and moved to the table where the leather book lay like a judge waiting to pass sentence. Flipping it open again, he scanned the pages by moonlight, his eyes catching on Holt's final entries, bitter words about a traitor who'd taken the gold in his trust, leaving him to die alone in the canyon's shadow. Elias's scar on his left hand throbbed as he read, a reminder of the bar fight that had marked him long before the stagecoach job went wrong. He hadn't meant for Holt to die, hadn't planned the chaos, but his choice to grab the sack of coins and run had sealed their fates. The cabin's objects took on new meaning now, each one a piece of the puzzle he'd ignored. The rusted knife could have been the one Holt carried, its blade dulled from years of scraping by. The lamp's cracked glass mirrored the fractured trust between them. Elias paced the small space, his boots stirring dust that danced in the faint light, and felt the walls closing in tighter, like the jaws of a trap he'd walked into willingly. "You set this up, didn't you?" he muttered to the empty air, picturing Holt's fevered hand writing that bloody warning, knowing somehow Elias would find this place. The thought sent a shudder through him, not from cold but from the truth he couldn't dodge anymore. He stopped by the door, still jammed shut, and pressed his forehead against the rough wood, his breath hitching as the weight of his own sins settled heavy on his shoulders. He'd spent years convincing himself he'd only done what he had to, survive, move on, forget the screams in the dark. But this cabin stripped that lie bare, forcing him to face the man he'd left behind, the partner he'd betrayed for a handful of gold he'd long since spent. Elias slid to the floor, the rifle clattering beside him, and stared at the blood-stained wall, its letters now a mirror reflecting his guilt. He was trapped, not just by the locked door, but by the ghosts of his own making, and there was no running from them now. The realization burned slow and deep, like a fire catching in dry brush, and Elias felt his defiance crumble under the weight of what he'd done. He didn't know if Holt's spirit lingered or if his own mind was conjuring the voice, but it didn't matter. The truth was here, in every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that flickered. He whispered to himself, "No way out but through," and knew the night wasn't done with him yet. The cabin held him tight, its silence a demand for reckoning, and Elias braced for whatever came next, his heart pounding with the certainty that he'd finally met his past head-on. Elias pushed himself up from the floor, the rifle slipping from his grasp to clatter against the wood as a raw scream tore from his throat, aimed at the invisible enemy that had haunted him all night. "You bastard, Holt. It was you or me that night, and I chose right," he bellowed, his voice cracking the silence like a whip, veins bulging in his neck from the force of it all. The words poured out unfiltered, years of buried blame exploding into the stale air, and he swung his fist wildly toward the bloody wall, as if Holt stood there, flesh and bone, ready for the reckoning. The cabin seemed to respond, the walls vibrating faintly with each shout, dust sifting down from the rafters like fine rain in the dim moonlight. He staggered forward, rage blinding him to the shadows that danced around his boots, and grabbed the edge of the table, flipping it over, with a crash that sent the knife and book skidding across the floor. "You think you can drag me back here to pay? I ain't sorry for surviving," he roared again, his face twisted in fury, spit flying from his lips as he pounded his chest with a free hand. The outburst left him heaving, chest rising and falling like bellows, but it didn't ease the fire inside. If anything, it fed it, turning grief into a weapon he wielded against the empty room. Elias kicked at the fallen chair, splintering it further, the crack of wood echoing his fracturing mind. His eyes locked on the lamp, still upright amid the chaos, its cracked glass glinting mockingly, and he brought his fist down hard on the table's remains, missing the edge and smashing straight into the lamp instead. The glass shattered with a sharp tinkling sound, oil spilling out in a dark puddle that caught the spark from the broken wick almost instantly. Flames leaped up hungry and orange, licking across the wood and catching the edges of the scattered pages from the book, which curled and blackened as the fire spread. The room filled with the acrid smell of burning oil and leather, the light casting erratic shadows that twisted like demons on the walls, turning the bloody leave into a glowing accusation bathed in crimson hues from the reflected blaze. Elias stepped back, the heat washing over his face like a slap, but he didn't move to stop it, watching as the fire climbed the table legs and jumped to the nearby curtain rag hanging by the window. His shouts died in his throat, replaced by ragged breaths as the reality sank in. The cabin was alive now with crackling flames, the air growing thick and hot, forcing him to shield his eyes from the growing inferno. The rage that had driven him ebbed into something hollow, leaving him staring at the destruction he'd unleashed, the past literally going up in smoke around him. He coughed as smoke billowed, stinging his eyes and throat, but the sight held him transfixed, the fiery glow illuminating every corner he'd feared. The flames roared louder, devouring the book completely now, Holt's words reduced to ash that swirled in the updraft, and Elias felt a twisted satisfaction mixed with the panic rising in his gut. He'd come here chasing ghosts, and now he'd burn the evidence, but the truth lingered in the heat pressing against his skin. He grabbed his rifle from the floor, the metal warm already, and backed toward the door, testing the handle again. It gave this time, swinging open to the cool night air. But as the fire's light spilled out into the canyon, painting the rocks in hellish red, Elias knew this wasn't victory. It was just the end of one chapter, with the weight of his choices still scorching his soul. Elias stumbled through the open door into the cool canyon air, smoke billowing out behind him, like a dark cloud chasing his heels as the flames roared higher inside the cabin. His lungs burned from the acrid haze, and he coughed hard, doubling over with hands on his knees while the heat pushed at his back, forcing him to stagger farther down the rocky slope. The fire had taken hold fast, licking up the dry walls and roof beams with hungry cracks that echoed off the canyon walls, turning the once quiet shelter into a bonfire that lit the night sky in flickering orange. He glanced back once, seeing the structure sag under the blaze, its crooked frame collapsing inward as timbers gave way, but he didn't stop to watch it all come down. He kept moving, boots slipping on loose gravel, until he reached a safer distance where the ground leveled out near a cluster of boulders, and there he sank to the dirt, his body shaking from the adrenaline crash and the chill that followed the fire's warmth. The rifle lay forgotten by the door in his haste, but he didn't go back for it. Nothing in that place was worth retrieving now, not with the book and its accusations reduced to ash swirling in the updraft. Elias wiped his face with a grimy sleeve, smearing soot across his skin, and stared out at the canyon's vast emptiness, the stars sharp above like indifferent witnesses to his unraveling. His hands trembled as he pulled out his canteen, taking a long swig of the stale water that did little to wash away the taste of smoke and regret. The exhaustion hit him then, deep and bone-weary, settling into his limbs like lead after the night's frenzy of voices and memories. He leaned against a boulder, the rough stone biting into his shoulder, and let his eyes close for a moment. But sleep wouldn't come easy with the distant pop of burning wood still reaching his ears. The truth he'd uncovered in that cabin weighed on him heavier than any pack he'd carried through the mountains. Holt's pain, his own betrayal, the cycle of greed that had led them both to ruin. Elias opened his eyes again, gazing at the dying glow of the fire, now just embers casting faint light on the ruins, and felt a hollow ache where anger had been. He rose unsteadily, brushing dust from his pants, and started down the trail away from the smoldering wreck. The canyon's silence wrapping around him once more, but changed now, laced with the finality of what he'd left behind. No gold, no rifle, no book, just the empty road ahead and the knowledge that some debts couldn't be burned away. Elias walked on into the dark, his steps slow and deliberate, carrying the heavy truth in his chest like a stone that would slow him for the rest of his days. The mountains stretched endless before him, but he knew the past would shadow every turn, a quiet companion he couldn't shake.